Could you see me over there? I don't think so. That's good. I'm naked. I'm kidding, I'm not naked. Alright, let's go through this again. Cool. We're right on target. Alright, everyone. Our next chapter is called Dying and Dying. Okay, we have two quotes in the beginning. The first is, "Those who have not been trained in chemistry or medicine may not realize how difficult the problem of cancer treatment really is. It is almost, not quite, but almost, as hard as finding some agent that will dissolve away the left ear, say, and leave the right ear unharmed. So slight is the difference between the cancer cell and its normal ancestor." Ooh, that's very cool. And that's by William Woglum. And here is another one. "Life is a Chemical Incident," by Paul Ehrlich, as a schoolboy, 1870. Cool. Alright, let's do this shit. "A systemic disease demands a systemic cure. But what kind of systemic therapy could possibly cure cancer? Could a drug, like a microscopic surgeon, perform an ultimate pharmacological mastectomy, sparing normal tissue while excising cancer cells? Willie Meyer wasn't alone in fantasizing about such a magical therapy. Generations of doctors before him had also fantasized about such a medicine. But how might a drug coursing through the whole body specifically attack a diseased organ? Give me a second. Oh, fuck, right. Whoopsies. My bad. I just remembered. The phone battery had stopped, and we did not actually, finish the chapter we're currently reading. Not currently, but the last chapter. That was why I was so confused. Okay. Oh, fuck, where did we stop? Okay, let's just begin at this rough paragraph. Okay. With the curious discovery of radium in 1902, surgeons could beam thousand-fold more powerful bursts of energy in tumors. Conferences and societies on high-dose radiation therapy were organized in a flurry of excitement. Radium was infused into gold wires and stitched directly into tumors to produce even higher local doses of X-rays. Surgeons implanted radon pellets into abdominal tumors. By the 1930s and 40s, America had a national surplus of radium, so much so that it was being advertised for sale to lay people in the back pages of journals. Vacuum tube technology advanced in parallel. By the mid-1950s, variants of these tubes could deliver blisteringly high doses of X-ray energy into cancerous tissues. Radiation therapy catapulted cancer medicine into its atomic age, an age replete with both promise and peril. Certainly, the vocabulary, the images, and the metaphors bore the potent symbolism of atomic power unleashed in cancer. There were cyclotrons, and supervoltage rays, and linear accelerators, and neutron beams. One man was asked to think of his X-ray therapy as millions of tiny bullets of energy. Another account of a radiation treatment is imbued with the thrill and horror of a space journey. The patient is put on a stretcher that is placed in the oxygen chamber. As a team of 6 doctors, nurses, and technicians hover at chamberside, the radiologist maneuvers a betatron into position. After slamming shut a hatch at the end of a chamber, technicians force oxygen in. After 15 minutes under full pressure, the radiologist turns on the Betatron and shoots radiation at the tumor. Following treatment, the patient is decompressed in deep-sea diver fashion and taken to the recovery room. Stuffed into chambers, herded in and out of hatches, hovered upon, monitored through closed-circuit television, pressurized, oxygenated, decompressed, and sent back to room to recover, patients weathered the onslaught of radiation therapy as if it were an invisible benediction. And for certain forms of cancer, it was a benediction. Like surgery, radiation was remarkably effective at obliterating locally confined cancers. Breast tumors were pulverized with X-rays. Lymphoma lumps melted away. One woman with a brain tumor woke up from her year-long coma to watch a basketball game in her hospital room. But like surgery, radiation medicine also struggled against its inherent limits. Emil Grube had already encountered the first of these limits with his earliest experimental treatments. Since X-rays could only be directed locally, radiation was of limited use for cancers that had metastasized. One could double and quadruple the doses of radiant energy, but this did not translate into more cures. Instead, indiscriminate irradiation left patients scarred, blinded, and scalded by doses that had far exceeded tolerability. The second limit was far more insidious. Radiation produced cancers. The very effect of X-rays killing rapidly dividing cells, DNA damage, also created cancer-causing mutations in genes. In the 1910s, soon after the Curies had discovered radium, a New Jersey corporation called U.S. Radium began to mix radium with paint to create a product called Undark, radium-infused paint that emitted a greenish-white light at night. Although aware of the many injurious effects of radium, U.S. Radium promoted Undark for clock dials, boasting of glow-in-the-dark watches. Watch painting was a precise and artisanal craft, and young women with nimble, steady hands were commonly employed. These women were encouraged to use the paint without precautions, and to frequently lick the brushes with their tongues to produce sharp lettering on watches. Radium workers soon began to complain of jaw pain, fatigue, and skin and tooth problems. In the late 1920s, medical investigations revealed that the bones in their jaws had necrosed, that their tongues had been scarred by irradiation, and many had become chronically anemic, a sign of severe bone marrow damage. Some women tested with radioactivity counters were found to be glowing with radioactivity. Over the next decade, dozens of radium-induced tumors sprouted in these radium-exposed workers, sarcomas and leukemias, and bone, tongue, neck, and jaw tumors. In 1927, a group of 5 severely afflicted women in New Jersey, collectively termed Radium Girls by the media, sued U.S. Radium. None of them had yet developed cancers. They were suffering from the more acute effects of radium toxicity: jaw, skin, and tooth necrosis. A year later, the case was settled out of court with a compensation of $10,000 each to the girls, and $600 per year to cover living and medical expenses. The compensation was not widely collected. Many of the Radium Girls, too weak even to raise their hands to take an oath in court, died of leukemia and other cancers soon after their case was settled. Marie Curie died of leukemia in July 1934. Emil Grube, who had been exposed to somewhat weaker X-rays, also succumbed to the deadly late effects of chronic radiation. By the mid-1940s, Grube's fingers had been amputated one by one to remove necrotic, and gangrenous bones, and his face was cut up in repeated operations to remove radiation-induced tumors and pre-malignant warts. In 1960, at the age of 85, he died in Chicago with multiple forms of cancer that had spread throughout his body. Ugh. The complex intersection of radiation with cancer curing at times, cancer causing at others, dampened the initial enthusiasm of cancer scientists. Radiation was a powerful invisible knife, but still a knife. And a knife, no matter how deft or penetrating, could only reach so far in the battle against cancer. A more discriminating therapy was needed, especially for cancers that were non-localized. In 1932, Willie Meyer, the New York surgeon who had invented the radical mastectomy contemporaneously with Halsted, was asked to address the annual meeting of the American Surgical Association. Gravely ill and bedridden, Meyer knew he would be unable to attend the meeting, but he forwarded a brief 6-paragraph speech to be presented. On May 31st, 6 weeks after Meyer's death, his letter was read aloud to the roomful of surgeons. There is, in that letter, an unfailing recognition that cancer medicine has reached some terminus, and that new direction was needed. If a biological systemic aftertreatment was added in every instance, Meyer wrote, we believe the majority of such patients would remain cured after a properly conducted radical operation. Meyer had grasped a deep principle about cancer. Cancer, even when it begins locally, is inevitably waiting to explode out of its confinement. By the time many patients come to their doctor, the illness has often spread beyond surgical control and spilled into their body exactly like the black bile that Galen had envisioned so vividly nearly 2,000 years ago. In fact, Galen seems to have been right after all, in the accidental aphoristic way that Democritus had been right about the atom, or Erasmus had made a conjecture about the Big Bang centuries before the discovery of galaxies. Galen had, of course, missed the actual cause of cancer. There was no black bile clogging up the body and bubbling out into tumors in frustration, but he had uncannily captured something essential about cancer in his dreamy and visceral metaphor. Cancer was often a humoral disease. Crab-like and constantly mobile, it could burrow through invisible channels from one organ to another. It was a systemic illness, just as Galen had once made it out to be. And finally, we come to dying and dying. Now, I won't read the quotes again. Let's go right to the main chapter stuff. Ooh, good crack. A systemic disease demands a systemic cure. But what kind of systemic therapy could possibly cure cancer? Could a drug, like a microscopic surgeon, perform an ultimate pharmacological mastectomy, sparing no more tissue while excising cancer cells? Willie Meyer wasn't alone in fantasizing about such a magical therapy. Generations of doctors before him had also fantasized about such a medicine. But how might a drug coursing through the whole body specifically attack a diseased organ? Specificity refers to the ability of any medicine to discriminate between its intended target and its host. Killing a cancer in a test tube is not a particularly difficult task. The chemical world is packed with malevolent poisons that, even in infinitesimal quantities, can dispatch a cancer cell within minutes. The trouble lies in finding a selective poison, a drug that will kill cancer without annihilating the patient. Systemic therapy without specificity is an indiscriminate bomb. For an anti-cancer poison to become a useful drug, Meyer knew, it needed to be a fantastically nimble knife. Sharp enough to cure cancer, yet selective enough to spare the patient. The hunt for such specific systemic poisons for cancer was precipitated by the search for a very different sort of chemical. The story begins with colonialism and its chief loot, cotton. In the mid-1850s, as ships from India and Egypt laden with bales of cotton unloaded their goods in English ports, cloth milling boomed into a spectacularly successful business in England, and in industry large enough to sustain an entire gamut of subsidiary industries. A vast network of mills sprouted up in the industrial basin of the Midlands, stretching through Glasgow, Lancashire, and Manchester. Textile exports dominated the British economy. Between 1851 and 1857, the export of printed goods from England more than quadrupled, from 6 million to 27 million pieces per year. In 1784, cotton products had represented a mere 6% of total British exports. By the 1850s, that proportion had peaked at 50%. The cloth milling boom set off a boom in cloth dyeing, but the two industries, cloth and color, were oddly out of technological step. Dyeing, unlike milling, was still a pre-industrial occupation. Cloth dyes had to be extracted from perishable vegetable sources, rusty carmines from Turkish madder root, or deep blues from the indigo plant, using antiquated processes that required patience, expertise, and constant supervision. Printing on textiles with colored dyes to produce the ever-popular calico prints, for instance, was even more challenging, requiring thickeners, mordants, and solvents in multiple steps, and often took the dyers weeks to complete. The textile industry thus needed professional chemists to dissolve its bleachers and cleansers, to supervise the extraction of dyes, and to find ways to fasten the dyes on cloth. A new discipline, called practical chemistry, focused on synthesizing products for textile dyeing, was soon flourishing in polytechnics and institutes all over London. Oh, my arm is already tired from holding up the book. I'm gonna change positions. Ugh. There we go. In 1856, William Perkin and 18-year-old students at one of these institutes stumbled upon what would soon become a holy grail of this industry, an inexpensive chemical dye that could be made entirely from scratch. In a makeshift one-room laboratory in his apartment in the East End of London, half of a small but long-shaped room with a few shelves for bottles and a table, Perkin was boiling nitric acid and benzene in smuggled glass flasks and precipitated an unexpected reaction. A chemical had formed inside the tubes with the color of pale, crushed violets. In an era obsessed with dye making, any colorful chemical was considered a potential dye, and a quick dip of a piece of cotton into the flask revealed the new chemical could color cotton. Moreover, this new chemical did not bleach or bleed. Perkin called it aniline mauve. Perkin's discovery was a godsend for the textile industry. Aniline mauve was cheap and imperishable, vastly easier to produce and store than vegetable dyes. As Perkin soon discovered, its parent compound could act as a molecular building block for other dyes, a chemical skeleton on which a variety of side chains could be hung to produce a vast spectrum of vivid colors. By the mid-1860s, a glut of new synthetic dyes in shades of lilac, blue, magenta, aquamarine, red, and purple flooded the cloth factories of Europe. In 1857, Perkin, barely 19 years old, was inducted into the Chemical Society of London as a full fellow, one of the youngest in its history to be honored. Aniline mauve was discovered in England, but dye making reached its chemical zenith in Germany. In the late 1850s, Germany, a rapidly industrializing nation, had been itching to compete in the cloth markets of Europe and America. But unlike England, Germany had scarcely any access to natural dyes. By the time it had entered the scramble to capture colonies, the world had already been sliced up into so many parts, with little left to divide. German cloth millers thus threw themselves into the development of artificial dyes, hoping to rejoin an industry that they had once almost given up as a lost cause. Dye making in England had rapidly become an intricate chemical business. In Germany, goaded by the textile industry, constituted by national subsidies and driven by expansive economic growth, synthetic chemistry underwent an even more colossal boom. In 1883, The German output of alizarin, the brilliant red chemical that imitated natural carmine, reached 12,000 tons, dwarfing the amount produced by Perkins' factory in London. German chemists rushed to produce brighter, stronger, cheaper chemicals and muscled their way into textile factories all around Europe. By the mid-1880s, Germany had emerged as the champion of the chemical arms race, which presaged a much uglier military one, to become the dye basket of Europe. Initially, the German textile chemists lived entirely in the shadow of the dye industry. But emboldened by their successes, the chemists began to synthesize not just dyes and solvents, but an entire universe of new molecules: phenols, alcohols, bromides, alkaloids, alizarins, and amides, chemicals never encountered in nature. By the late 1870s, synthetic chemists in Germany had created more molecules than they knew what to do with. Practical chemistry had become almost a caricature of itself, an industry seeking a practical purpose for the products that it had so frantically raced to invent. Cool. All right. That was a break, by the way, but let's keep going. Early interactions between synthetic chemistry and medicine had largely been disappointing. Gideon Harvey, a 17th century physician, had once called the chemists the most imprudent, ignorant, flatulent, fleshy, and vainly boasting sort of mankind. I do agree with the flatulent part. The mutual scorn and animosity between the two disciplines had persisted. In 1849, August Hofmann, William Perkins' teacher at the Royal College, gloomily acknowledged the chasm between medicine and chemistry. None of these compounds have, as yet, found their way into the appliances of life. We have not been able to use them for curing disease. But even Hofmann knew that the boundary between the synthetic world and the natural world was inevitably collapsing. In 1828, a Berlin scientist named Friedrich Wöhler had sparked a metaphysical storm in science by boiling ammonium cyanate, a plain inorganic salt, and creating urea, a chemical typically produced by the kidneys. The Wöhler experiment, seemingly trivial, had enormous implications. Urea was a natural chemical, while its precursor was an inorganic salt. That a chemical produced by natural organisms could be derived so easily in a flask threatened to overturn the entire conception of living organisms. For centuries, the chemistry of living organisms was thought to be imbued with some mystical property of vital essence that could not be duplicated in a laboratory, a theory called vitalism. Wöhler's experiment demolished vitalism. Organic and inorganic chemicals, he proved, were interchangeable. Biology was chemistry. Perhaps even the human body was no different from a bag of busily reacting chemicals, a beaker with arms, legs, eyes, brain, and soul. With vitalism dead, the extension of this logic to medicine was inevitable. If the chemicals of life could be synthesized in a laboratory, could they work on living systems? If biology and chemistry were so interchangeable, could a molecule concocted in a flask affect the inner workings of a biological organism? Wöhler was a physician himself, and with his students and collaborators, he tried to backpedal from the chemical world into the medical one. But his synthetic molecules were still much too simple. Mere stick figures of chemistry, where vastly more complex molecules were needed to intervene on living cells. But such multifaceted chemicals already existed. In the laboratories of the dye factories of Frankfurt were full of them. To build this interdisciplinary bridge between biology and chemistry, Wöhler only needed to take a short day trip from his laboratory in Göttingen to the labs of Frankfurt. But neither Wöhler nor his students could make that last connection. The vast panel of molecules sitting idly on the shelves of the German textile chemists, the precursor of a revolution in medicine, may as well have been a continent away. How many breaks are left? How many pages? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Interesting. Let's keep going. This is a break, by the way, but let's keep going. It took a full 50 years after Wohler's urea experiment for the products of the dye industry to finally make physical contact with living cells. In 1878, in Leipzig, a 24-year-old medical student, Paul Ehrlich, hunting for a thesis project, proposed using cloth dyes, aniline and its color derivatives, to stain animal tissues. Why are there 5 commas in a single sentence? That's bollocks, dude. Anyways, at best, Ehrlich hoped that the dyes might stain the tissues to make microscopy easier. But to his astonishment, the dyes were far from indiscriminate darkening agents. Aniline derivatives stained only parts of the cell, silhouetting certain structures and leaving others untouched. The dye seemed able to discriminate among chemicals hidden inside cells, binding some and sparing others. This molecular specificity, encapsulated so vividly in that reaction between a dye and a cell, began to haunt Ehrlich. In 1882, working with Robert Koch, he discovered yet another novel chemical stain, this time for mycobacteria, the organisms that Koch had discovered as the cause of tuberculosis. A few years later, Ehrlich found that certain toxins injected into animals could generate antitoxins, which bound and inactivated poisons with extraordinary specificity. These antitoxins would later be identified as antibodies. He purified a potent serum against diphtheria toxin from the blood of horses, then moved to the Institute of Serum Research and Serum Testing in Steglitz to prepare the serum in gallon buckets, and then to Frankfurt to set up his own laboratory. But the more vividly Ehrlich explored the biological world, the more he spiraled back to his original idea. The biological universe was full of molecules picking out their partners like clever locks designed to fit a key. Toxins clinging inseparably to antitoxins, dyes that highlighted only particular parts of cells, chemical stains that could nimbly pick out one class of germs from a mixture of microbes. If biology was an elaborate mix-and-match game of chemicals, Ehrlich reasons, what if some chemical could discriminate bacterial cells from animal cells and kill the former without touching the host? Returning from a conference late one evening in the cramped compartment of a night train from Berlin to Frankfurt, Ehrlich animatedly described his idea to 2 fellow scientists. It has occurred to me that it should be possible to find artificial substances which are really and specifically curative for certain diseases, not merely palliatives acting favorably on one or another symptom. Such curative substances, a priori, must directly destroy the microbes responsible for the disease, not by action from a distance, but only when the chemical compound is fixed by the parasites. The parasites can only be killed if the chemical compound has a particular relation, a special affinity for them. By then, the other inhabitants of Ehrlich's train compartment had dozed off to sleep, but this rant in the train compartment was one of medicine's most important ideas in its distilled primordial form. Chemotherapy, the use of specific chemicals to heal the diseased body, was conceptually born in the middle of the night. I give birth to many things in the middle of my night, but that's too adult for YouTube.
Hey, I'm washing. Who is this?
Anyways, let's keep going. Okay, let's keep going. Ehrlich began looking for his curative substances in a familiar place, the treasure trove of dye industry chemicals that had proved so crucial to his earlier biological experiments. His laboratory was now physically situated near the booming dye factories of Frankfurt, the Frankfurter Anlagenfarbenfabrik, and the Leopold Casella Company, and he could easily procure dye chemicals and derivatives via a short walk across the valley. With thousands of compounds available to him, Ehrlich embarked on a series of experiments to test their biological effects in animals. He began with a hunt for antimicrobial chemicals, in part because he already knew that chemical dyes could specifically bind microbial cells. He infected mice and rabbits with Trypanosoma brucei, the parasite responsible for the dreaded sleeping sickness, then injected the animals with chemical derivatives to determine if any of them could halt the infection. After several hundred chemicals, and I presume several hundred dead animals, Ehrlich and his collaborators had their first antibiotic hit, a brilliant ruby-colored dye derivative that Ehrlich called Trypan Red. It was a disease juxtaposed with a dye color that captured nearly a century of medical history. Galvanized by his discovery, Ehrlich unleashed volleys of chemical experiments. A universe of biological chemistry opened up before him. Molecules with peculiar properties, a cosmos governed with a universe of biological chemistry opened up before him. Molecules with peculiar properties, a cosmos governed by idiosyncratic rules. Some compounds switched from precursors into active drugs in the bloodstream. Others transformed backwards from active drugs to inactive molecules. Some were excreted in the urine. Others condensed in the bile or fell apart immediately in the blood. One molecule might survive for days in an animal, but its chemical cousin, a variant by just a few critical atoms, might vanish from the body in minutes. On April 19, 1910, at the densely packed Congress for Internal Medicine in Wiesbaden, Ehrlich announced that he had discovered yet another molecule with a specific affinity, this one a blockbuster. The new drug, cryptically called Compound 606, was active against the notorious microbe Treponema pallidum, which caused syphilis. In Ehrlich's era, syphilis, the secret malady of 18th century Europe, was a sensational illness, a tabloid pestilence. Ehrlich knew that an anti-syphilitic drug would be an instant sensation, and he was prepared. Compound 606 had secretly been tested in patients in the hospital wards of St. Petersburg, then retested in patients with neurosyphilis at the Magdeburg Hospital, each time with remarkable success. A gigantic factory, funded by Höchst Chemical Works, was already being built to manufacture it for commercial use. Ehrlich's successes with Trypan Red and Compound 606, which he named Salvarsan from the word salvation, proved that diseases were just pathological locks waiting to be picked by just the right molecules. The line of potentially curable illnesses now stretched endlessly before him. Ehrlich called his drugs magic bullets for their capacity to kill and magic for their specificity. It was a phrase with an ancient alchemic ring that would sound insistently through the future of oncology. Let's keep going. We're very close to the end. Ehrlich's magic bullets had one last target to fell: cancer. Syphilis and trypanosomiasis are microbial diseases. Ehrlich was slowly inching towards his ultimate goal, the malignant human cell. Between 1904 and 1908, he rigged several elaborate schemes to find an anti-cancer drug using his vast arsenal of chemicals. He tried amides, anilines, sulfur derivatives, arsenics, bromides, and alcohols to kill cancer cells. None of them worked. What was poison to cancer cells, he found, was inevitably poison to normal cells as well. Discouraged, he tried even more fantastical strategies. He thought of starving sarcoma cells of metabolites or tricking them into death by using decoy molecules, a strategy that would presage Subaru's antifolate derivatives by nearly 50 years. But the search for the ultimate discriminating anti-cancer drug proved fruitless. His pharmacological bullets, far from magical, were either too indiscriminate or too weak. In 1908, soon after Ehrlich won the Nobel Prize for his discovery of the principle of specific affinity, Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany invited him to a private audience in his palace. The Kaiser was seeking counsel, a noted hypochondriac afflicted by various real and imagined ailments. He wanted to know whether Ehrlich had an anti-cancer drug within reach. Ehrlich hedged. The cancer cell, he explained, was a fundamentally different target from a bacterial cell. Specific affinity relied, paradoxically, not on affinity, but on its opposite, on difference. Ehrlich's chemicals had successfully targeted bacteria because bacterial enzymes were so radically dissimilar to human enzymes. With cancer, it was the similarity of the cancer cell to the normal human cell that made it nearly impossible to target. Ehrlich went on in this vein, almost musing to himself. He was circling around something profound, an idea in its infancy. To target the abnormal cell, one would need to decipher the biology of the normal cell. He had returned, decades after his first encounter with aniline, to specificity again, to the barcodes of biology hidden inside every living cell. Ehrlich's thinking was lost on the Kaiser. Having little interest in the cheerless disquisition with no obvious end, he cut the audience short. And let's go on and finish the chapter. That was the last break. In 1915, Ehrlich fell ill with tuberculosis, a disease that he had likely acquired from his days in Koch's laboratory. He went to recuperate in Bad Homburg, a spa town famous for its healing carbonic salt baths. From his room, overlooking the distant plains below, he watched bitterly as his country pitched itself into the First World War. The dye factories that had once supplied his therapeutic chemicals, Bayer and Hoechst among them, were converted to massive producers of chemicals that would be turned into precursors for war gases. One particularly toxic gas was a colorless, blistering liquid produced by reacting the solvent thiodeglycol, a dye intermediate, with boiling hydrochloric acid. The gases smell was unmistakable, described alternatively as reminiscent of mustard, burnt garlic, or horseradishes ground on a fire. It became known as mustard gas. On a foggy night of July 12, 1917, 2 years after Ehrlich's death, a volley of artillery shells marked with small yellow crosses rained down on British troops stationed near the small Belgian town of Ypres. The liquid in the bombs quickly vaporized, a thick yellowish-green cloud veiling the sky, a soldier recalled, then diffused through the cool night air. The men in the barracks and trenches, asleep for the night, awoke to a nauseatingly sharp smell that they would remember for decades to come, the acrid whiff of horseradishes spreading through the chalk fields. Within seconds, soldiers ran for cover, coughing and sneezing in the mud, the blind scrambling among the dead. Mustard gas diffused through leather and rubber, and soaked through layers of cloth. It hung like a toxic mist over the battlefield for days. Hello.
You're gonna see that.
I know. It hung like a toxic mist over the battlefield for days until the dead smelled of mustard. On that night alone, mustard gas injured or killed 2,000 soldiers. In a single year, it left thousands dead in its wake. The acute short-term effects of nitrogen mustard produced some mustard gas of my own. The respiratory complications, the burnt skin, the blisters, and the blindness were so amply monstrous that its long-term effects were overlooked. In 1919, a pair of American pathologists, Edward and Helen Krumhar, analyzed the effects of the Ypres bombing on the few men who had survived it. They had found that the survivors had an unusual condition of the bone marrow. The normal blood-forming cells had dried up. The bone marrow, in a bizarre mimicry of the scorched and blasted battlefield, was markedly depleted. The men were anemic and needed transfusions of blood, often up to once a month. They were prone to infections. Their white cell counts often hovered persistently below normal. In a world less preoccupied with other horrors, this news might have caused a small sensation among cancer doctors. Although evidently poisonous, this chemical had, after all, targeted the bone marrow and wiped out only certain populations of cells, a chemical with specific affinity. But Europe was full of horror stories in 1919, and these seemed no more remarkable than any other. The Krumhars published their paper in a second-tier medical journal, and it was quickly forgotten in the amnesia of war. The wartime chemists went back to their labs to devise new chemicals for other battles, and the inheritors of Ehrlich's legacy went hunting elsewhere for his specific chemicals. They were looking for a magic bullet that would rid the body of cancer, not a toxic gas that would leave its victims half dead, blind, blistered, and permanently anemic. That the bullet would eventually appear out of that very chemical weapon seemed like a perversion of specific affinity, a ghoulish distortion of Ehrlich's dream. Oh, goodness. The next chapter is surprisingly short. And that's called Poisoning the Atmosphere. There are two quotes here. What if this mixture does not work at all? What if it be a poison? And that's from Romeo and Juliet. Well, which one, Romeo or Juliet? I'm kidding. Probably Romeo. Anyways, we shall so poison the atmosphere of the first act that no one of decency shall want to see the play through to the end. And that is by James Watson, speaking about chemotherapy. Wasn't that the same Watson that discovered DNA? I mean, not discovered, but like built the full structure, you know. Anyways, every drug, the 16th century physician Paracelsus once opined, is a poison in disguise. Cancer chemotherapy, consumed by its fiery obsession to obliterate the cancer cell, found its roots in the obverse logic. Every poison might be a drug in disguise. On December 2nd, 1943, more than 25 years after the Yellow Cross bombs had descended on Ypres, a fleet of Luftwaffe planes flew by a group of American ships huddled in a harbor just outside Bari in southern Italy and released a volley of shells. The ships were instantly on fire. Unbeknownst even to its own crew, one of the ships in the fleet, the John Harvey, was stockpiled with 70 tons of mustard gas stowed away for possible use. As the Harvey blew up, so too did its toxic payload. The Allies had, in effect, bombed themselves. The German raid was unexpected and a terrifying success. Fishermen and residents around the Bari harbor began to complain of the whiff of burnt garlic and horseradishes in the breeze. Grimy, oil-soaked men, mostly young American sailors, were dragged out from the water seething with pain and terror, their eyes swollen shut. They were given tea and wrapped in blankets, which only trapped the gas closer to their bodies. Of the 617 men rescued, 83 died within the first week. The gas spread quickly over the Bari harbor, leaving an arc of devastation. Nearly 1,000 men and women died of complications over the next months. The Berry Incident, as the media called it, was a terrible political embarrassment for the Allies. The injured soldiers and sailors were swiftly relocated to the States, and medical examiners were secretly flown in to perform autopsies on the dead civilians. The autopsies revealed what the Krumhars had noted earlier. In the men and women who had initially survived the bombing but succumbed later to injuries, white blood cells had virtually vanished in their blood, and the bone marrow was scorched and depleted. The gas had specifically targeted bone marrow cells, a grotesque molecular parody of Ehrlich's healing chemicals. The Berry incident accelerated the effort to investigate war gases and their effects on soldiers. An undercover unit called the Chemical Warfare Unit, housed within the Wartime Office of Scientific Research and Development, was created to study war gases. Contracts for research on various toxic compounds were spread across research institutions around the nation. The contract for investigating nitrogen mustard was issued to two scientists, Louis Goldman and Alfred Gilman, at Yale University. Goodman and Gilman weren't interested in the vesicant properties of mustard gas, its capacity to burn skin and membranes. They were captivated by the Krumhar effect, the gas's capacity to decimate white blood cells. Could this effect, or some etiolated cousin of it, be harnessed in a controlled setting in a hospital in tiny monitored doses to target malignant white blood cells? To test this concept, Gilman and Goldman began with animal studies. Injected intravenously into rabbits and mice, the mustard made the normal white blood cells of the blood and bone marrow almost disappear, without producing all the nasty vesicant actions, dissociating the two pharmacological effects. Encouraged, Gilman and Goldman moved on to human studies, focusing on lymphomas, cancers of the lymph glands. In 1942, they persuaded a thoracic surgeon, Gustav Lindskog, to treat a 48-year-old New York silversmith with lymphoma with 10 continuous doses of intravenous mustard. It was a one-off experiment, but it worked. In men, as in mice, the drug produced miraculous remissions. The swollen glands disappeared. Clinicians described the phenomenon as an eerie softening of the cancer, as if the hard carapace of cancer that Galen had so vividly described nearly 2,000 years ago had melted away. But the responses were followed inevitably by relapses. The softened tumors would harden again and recur, just as Farber's leukemias had vanished and then reappeared violently. Bound by secrecy during the war years, Goodman and Gilman eventually published their findings in 1946, several months before Farber's paper on antifolates appeared in the press. Oh, my neck hurts. Just a few hundred miles south of Yale, at the Burroughs Wellcome Laboratory in New York, the biochemist George Hitchings had also turned to Ehrlich's method to find molecules with a specific ability to kill cancer cells. Inspired by Yella Subaraw's antifolates, Hitchings focused on synthesizing decoy molecules that, when taken up by cells, killed them. His first targets were precursors of RNA and DNA. Hitchings' approach was broadly disdained by academic scientists as a fishing expedition. Scientists in academia stood disdainfully apart from this kind of activity, colleagues of Hitchings recalled. They argued that it would be premature to attempt chemotherapy without sufficient basic knowledge about biochemistry, physiology, and pharmacology. In truth, the field had been sterile for 35 years or so since Ehrlich's work. By 1944, Hitchings' fishing expedition had yet to yield a single chemical fish. Mounds of bacterial plates had grown around him like a molding, decrepit garden with still no sign of a promised drug. Almost on instinct, he hired a young assistant named Gertrude Elion, whose future seemed even more precarious than Hitchings'. The daughter of a Lithuanian immigrant, Born with a precocious scientific intellect and a thirst for chemical knowledge, Elian had completed a master's degree in chemistry from New York University in 1941 while teaching high school science during the day and performing her research for her thesis at night and on weekends. Although highly qualified, talented, and driven, she had been unable to find a job in the academic laboratory. Frustrated by repeated rejections, she had found a position as a supermarket product supervisor. When Hitchings found Trudy Elian, who would soon become one of the most innovative synthetic chemists of her generation and a future Nobel laureate, she was working for a food lab in New York, testing the acidity of pickles and the color of egg yolk going into mayonnaise. Rescued from a life of pickles and mayonnaise, Gertrude Elian leapt into synthetic chemistry. Like Hitchings, she started off by hunting for chemicals that could block bacterial growth by inhibiting DNA, but then added her own strategic twist. Instead of sifting through mounds of unknown chemicals at random, Elian focused on one class of chemicals called purines. Purines were ring-like molecules with a central core of carbon atoms that were known to be involved in the building of DNA. She thought she would add various chemical side chains to each of the carbon atoms, producing dozens of new variants of purine. Elian's collection of new molecules was a strange merry-go-round of beasts. One molecule, 2,6-diaminopurine, was too toxic at even low dosage to give the drug to animals. Another molecule smelled like garlic purified 1,000 times. Many were unstable or useless or both. But in 1951, Elian found a variant molecule called 6-mercaptopurine, or 6-MP. 6-MP failed some preliminary toxicological tests on animals. The drug is strangely toxic to dogs and was nearly abandoned. But the success of mustard gas in killing cancer cells had boosted the confidence of early chemotherapists. In 1948, Cornelius Dusty Rhodes, a former Army officer, left his position as chief of the Army's Chemical Warfare Unit to become the director of the Memorial Hospital and its attached Research Institute, thus sealing the connection between the chemical warfare of the battlefields and chemical warfare in the body. Intrigued by the cancer-killing properties of poisonous chemicals, Rhodes actively pursued a collaboration between Hitchings and Elian's labs at Borough Wellcome and Memorial Hospital. Within months of having been tested on cells in a petri dish, 6-MP was packaged off to be tested on human patients. Predictably, the first target was acute lymphoblastic leukemia, the rare tumor that now occupied the limelight of oncology. In the early 1950s, two physician-scientists, Joseph Birkenau and Mary Louise Murphy, launched a clinical trial at Memorial to use 6-MP on children with ALL. Birkenau and Murphy was astonished by the speedy remissions produced by 6-MP. Leukemia cells flickered and vanished in the bone marrow and the blood, often within a few days of treatment. But, like the remissions at Boston, these were disappointingly temporary, lasting only a few weeks. As with the antifolates, there was only a fleeting glimpse of a cure. How have we done? About an hour. That's fine. Alright. I'll end it there. We've done 2 chapters. We're at page 93. Good stuff. Alright. See you guys. I don't know. Tomorrow's a busy day. Maybe Wednesday, maybe tomorrow. I don't know. See how it goes.